Welcome to our Focus on Pharmacology COVID vaccine between myth and reality. Today we have Dr. Paul Thomas of St. Jude Hospital, who's going to help us answer a few frequently asked questions on COVID vaccines. Mohammed, do you want to go ahead and ask the first question?
Yeah, sure. So the first question comes to the public minds is, how safe are the COVID-19 vaccines in comparison to the influenza vaccine?
So all of the COVID-19 vaccines that have been approved so far are, you could think of as equivalently safe to the common vaccines that we routinely get, either in childhood vaccinations or the flu vaccine. There are, some reactogenicity effects, meaning that you're gonna feel some side effects like you do after the tetanus shot, or like some people do after the flu vaccine. Your arm might be sore, you might feel a little bit tired. Some people even run a fever. But the number of very serious reactions has been extremely, extremely low.
Thank you. Following on the same theme of influenza vaccination, how frequent do we anticipate administering COVID-19 vaccines?
It's not entirely clear, the reason we have to give a flu vaccine every year, one of the reasons we have to give a flu vaccine every year is that the flu mutates at an extremely high rate, and there are multiple strains of flu virus, and they're all shifting around a bit every year. Coronaviruses as a family actually mutate far less frequently than influenza viruses. And so from that perspective, maybe we would have to give fewer booster shots. On the other hand, we've already seen some evidence that the coronavirus is evolving a bit and is potentially mutating in a way that would escape some of the vaccines that we've made already. And so there might need to be some boosters. All of the companies are working on variant versions of their vaccines to allow boosters to be made. That said, all of the platforms that we're talking about now for coronavirus, so the RNA vaccines, even the Novavax adjuvanted vaccine, which is a recombinant protein vaccine, which is kind of like the flu vaccine, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, all generate somewhat more of a robust immune response than the normal flu vaccine. And so it's possible that they'll last longer and that we might not need a booster.
So do you think, Dr. Thomas, that we might need like an annual vaccination if the virus keeps mutating every year?
If it were to mutate at the rate of flu, then we may need that. On the other hand, as I said, it mutates less frequently than the flu, and it does seem that the immunity that's generated by the current vaccines that we have are good and potentially persist a bit longer than maybe what we generate with the flu vaccine. And so, I think everybody's goal would be to potentially not have to add another vaccine to the annual vaccination. But I think that would be, a worst case scenario. I think maybe a more likely scenario is something like every 2 years or 3 years. And there's a number of efforts right now to actually explore different vaccine constructs where you would, like we do for the flu, include multiple variant strains so that you maybe would have more of a universal type of shot that would last even longer.
Wonderful, thank you. So the next question is, how soon are antibodies created after vaccination, and do they offer protection from COVID-19 vaccine?
From COVID-19 infection?
Yeah.
Sure. So antibodies start being made quite quickly after vaccination, probably, in terms of at the level that we could measure in the lab, somewhere around 5 to 7 days after the vaccination, you could detect them. But they have to develop and accumulate for a while to reach the level at which they're probably truly protective. And so in the trials that have been done so far, the time at which the studies have all sort of agreed that the vast majority of people have made enough antibodies that they're protected from infection, or at least from symptomatic infection, is somewhere around a month after the first shot, and a week after the second shot, which is usually about a month after the first shot. With the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it's only a single shot, and so that's also about a month after that single shot. By 2 weeks after the first shot, there's probably about half the people are already protected, and that probably corresponds to on average, younger, healthier, robust people, whereas people that are, at all immunocompromised or immunosuppressed or maybe a bit older might need that second shot and a little bit longer for antibodies to develop.
So the most common questions that people have, and for the people administering the vaccine, do you think they might be like source of transferring the virus community once they receive the vaccine?
You cut out a bit, Mohammed. I think was the question, once you've received the vaccine, are you likely to still transmit the virus?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So the studies to prove that definitively one way or another are pretty difficult to do, as you can imagine. So you would need to get a group of people that you vaccinate and a group of people maybe that you don't vaccinate and compare them over time for asymptomatic infection, right? Because we're interested now in sort of any level of infection. And so that requires testing people frequently, whether or not they're sick or not. So those are very expensive studies and difficult studies to do. And so we may not get, a lot of those studies very quickly. A small number of those studies have been done already and are been reported in various forms. And they all do suggest, as you would expect, given the type of immune response that's being generated, that if you are making the level of antibodies that the average person makes after these vaccines, you are unlikely to either get the virus, and if you do get the virus, that you are shedding very, very low levels of the virus, and so you're less likely to infect other people. Myself or anybody else in the field is very reluctant to say absolutely there's no way you can make anybody else sick, because those studies are hard to do and that data is not available. But if you asked me to bet on whether or not someone was more or less likely to transmit the virus after the vaccine, I think it's clear that they're much less likely to transmit the virus. It's just a question of how much less likely.
Great, thank you. So I think one of the biggest concerns about vaccines, since some of them are genetically created or their genetic material, is can they alter human DNA? Can they cause abnormalities upon pregnancy or affect fertility?
These are great questions. Right now, the studies in pregnant women haven't been done in the way that they're normally done for a new drug product. So all of these vaccines were approved under something called the emergency use authorization, which allowed companies to accelerate the approval process and not do all of the sort of safety subgroup studies that they would normally do. That said, many pregnant women have received all of these different vaccine platforms. And there have been papers published already analyzing the responses in those women, and there's been no adverse effects detected either on the woman or on the baby pre or post-term. And so it's not an official conclusion yet. It's not endorsed by the FDA, but those data are being accumulated, and there hasn't been a safety signal yet. In terms of whether or not these, particularly like the RNA vaccines, could affect you genetically, RNA is a sort of temporary blueprint for a protein that your cell makes in huge quantities all the time to make all the proteins in the cell. The critical genetic code that is the core of your identity and the core of your cell's lineage is encoded in DNA. And outside of very special circumstances, RNA cannot turn into DNA. And certainly in the circumstance of the RNA vaccines that we have, there's none of the mechanism present to take that RNA and turn it into DNA. So that RNA will never even be in the nucleus of your cell, which is where the DNA is housed. So they're just even spatially completely separated. And then they're chemically sort of prevented from really interacting with each other.
Wonderful.
So one of the CDC recommendation right now is to still give the vaccine to people who got infected with COVID-19, but they kind of recovered naturally. So my question is, do you think the vaccination is offering any kind of benefit to those people?
So in the short little talk that I just gave, I showed a slide from a paper that was just very recently published that looked at vaccine levels in people that had recovered, that had normal sort of course of COVID-19 infection. They weren't particularly severe. and then went on to get vaccinated. And in virtually all of those people getting the vaccine, particularly the first dose of the vaccine, and this was the mRNA vaccine, they substantially boosted their antibody levels. And they boosted them about to the level of someone that had received 2 doses of the vaccine. And so if you've just had coronavirus and recovered from it, your antibody levels are on average lower than somebody that's received the vaccine. And in some of the vaccine studies that have been done already, there are hints in the data and some strong indications that being vaccinated is actually more protective than having been infected, which is actually somewhat surprising from an immunological perspective. It's an interesting result. The vaccine is better than getting the natural infection. And so even if you've had the natural infection, the strong recommendation is that you still get the vaccine. There's some discussion right now about whether or not there can be a recommendation that you only need 1 dose of a 2-dose vaccine, but that has not been concluded yet, and the FDA still recommends getting both doses of the vaccine.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. So are there any populations that should not take the vaccines currently?
So for any person, they should consult with their own doctor about their particular health issues as to whether or not they should get the vaccine, but none of the vaccines are approved for anybody under the age of 16 yet. So the only sort of single big group of people that is excluded from the recommendation are children. And that's just because the studies are still underway to determine the safety in children, but those have already started.
Thank you. So outside of children, any other group is now included in the CDC recommendations?
All other groups are included. Different states are recommending different people at different times for the vaccine. You may have a medical condition that would prevent you from getting it for various reasons, but that would be something to discuss with your doctor. There's no single group that's been excluded beyond children.
Thank you for clarifying that, Mohammed.
So do you think, Dr. Thomas, that any major side effects have been reported for people who have been already administered the vaccine?
You cut out again at the very beginning there. Something about side effects for people that have administered the vaccine?
Yeah, so if you can highlight the side effects, the most common side effects for administration.
What are the most common side effects?
Yeah.
So for all of the vaccines, they're the sort of things that you associate with almost any vaccination. There's soreness around the site of the vaccine. So you might have a sore arm. And then various other sort of symptoms of kind of getting a cold, a little bit achy, feverish. Fatigue is probably the #1 symptom that's been reported, but they usually resolve within 24 hours to 48 hours after the shot. With most people, particularly people that have not been infected before, the symptoms occur after the second shot for the RNA vaccines. For people who have been infected before, they tend to happen after the first shot.
So there is no kind of specific contraindication for administering the vaccine for immunocompromised patients?
Not that I'm aware of, at least for the RNA vaccines, and I think also even for the viral vector vaccines. It would depend on the specific form of the immunodeficiency, though, probably. Again, you should discuss it with your personal doctor in that case.
Thank
Great.
you.
I'm really curious because a lot of companies started programs to make COVID-19 vaccines. I'm curious about how many vaccines are you anticipating to get an FDA approval?
So we have 3 right now, which are the Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson in the US. Elsewhere in the world, AstraZeneca has been approved. In China and some other countries, there's a couple of vaccines from Sinovac. In terms of what's probably coming here to the US, AstraZeneca is still in trials here. And then whether or not they apply for approval, I guess remains to be seen. The one that I expect to be next, just from where they are in their publications and in their trials, is Novavax in the US. They've already published the result of their immunogenicity and protection data in Europe and in South Africa, and they were both very good, and they're finishing their trial here. It's also, one of the platforms that we don't have. So it's a recombinant protein vaccine versus an RNA vaccine, which is Moderna and Pfizer. and the inactivated virus vaccine, viral vector vaccine, which is Johnson & Johnson. So it would give us another kind of vaccine, which, might be useful for addressing, special circumstances of specific groups of people. And in terms of what the government has pre-purchased with those 4 companies, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and Novavax, I think there's enough to vaccinate everyone in the US.
Wonderful. And if I'm going to take the question outside of the US, so we've heard recently about reports of many countries stopping AstraZeneca vaccine and then clearing it for administration again. And my question is, in many African countries, they only have access to the AstraZeneca vaccine. Can you just tell us a little bit about these side effects, and is it really safe to take AstraZeneca vaccine now?
So I have to defer on that to the regulatory agencies that have declared that it is safe. The side effects that have been reported that most recently caused the stoppage was a clotting disorder that was appearing in what everyone agrees is a very small number of people, but it was a very serious side effect. One of the reasons why this vaccine is generally available in a lot of different countries is it has very tolerant storage conditions. And so it can be shipped and travel for an extended period of time without, a lot of special conditions around it, versus something like the other extreme, which is the Pfizer vaccine, which has to be at very, very cold temperatures. And so, the authorities that have looked at it in Europe and elsewhere so far have come to the conclusion that it is safe and it is effective in terms of the thresholds that have been set for what was going to be considered an effective vaccine. It has shown a bit lower efficacy than some of the other vaccines that have been approved. And it has also struggled to protect against some of the variants that are appearing, though many of these other vaccines have not been directly tested against the variants in the way that AstraZeneca has. And so I think for right now, the recommendation would be that any approved vaccine is better than no vaccine. I think, a year from now, and I'm not singling out AstraZeneca or any other vaccine for that matter, as we get to hopefully very quickly, we get to a point where everybody's had a chance to get at least one vaccine, we might start thinking about what's going to be the best combination of vaccines for the world going forward.
Thank you. Mohammed, do you have any more questions?
I think that's it. Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, for sharing all this very informative talk about this.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And we're looking forward to learning from you in the near future.